Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of GeoStrata Extra. My name is Brad Keeler. I'm the director of the Geo-Institute of ASCE. If you are not familiar with the Geo-Institute, you should become so. We are a technical society housed within the American Society of Civil Engineers. We have about 12,000 members, all of whom, or most of whom, are geotechnical engineers and or geologists. We do many different valuable activities. You can find out more at geoinstitute.org. As for what we are doing here, if you like what you see today, and I hope you will, I think you will, we want you to click on that subscribe button, click get notifications up at the top of the screen so that we will let you know every single time we post a new video to the channel, which is frequently. I want to also tell you that today's episode of GeoStrata Extra is brought to you by GeoExtreme, ASCE's first post-pandemic in-person conference. We will be in Savannah, Georgia, November 7th through the 10th. And we would love to see you there. Hazards, climate change, extreme events. These are all on the agenda. Great exhibit hall that's almost sold out. We want you to be there. You can find out more at the link in the description. What we are going to do today is have a little extra. The May, June, July issue of GeoStrata is out. You will notice there are 3 months on it. We have rejigged the publication schedule of the magazine a little bit. Hopefully you have it in your hands as we speak. One of our esteemed editors, Chris Woods of Densification, will be interviewing Donald Bruce, Geosystems LP, about his piece in this issue of the magazine on equipment manufacturers and specialty contracting. We are very happy to have you both with us today. So thanks to both of you for joining us. And Chris, I'll now send it over to you.
Well, thank you, Brad. The words are always kind, and I appreciate it. Good afternoon to everyone out there. Compared to last year this time, hopefully everyone's actually getting started on the beginning of a fun and relaxing summer this time around. As Brad said, my name's Chris Woods. I am a member of the GeoStrata editorial board, and for my day job, I'm a vice president with Densification Inc., which we are specialty dynamic compaction contractors based here in Washington, D.C. Happy to be back as the host of this edition of GeoStrata Extra. Today, I'll have the privilege of talking with Dr. Donald Bruce, president of Geosystems LP. Donald has spent decades in the geotechnical specialty contractor realm and has for nearly 20 years offered his perspectives in geostrata on topics as varied as micropiles, grouting, deep mixing, and crisis management and real-time response. Now, given the theme of the May, June, July issue, which is specialty geoconstruction equipment, it was justly fitting to add his insights and experience in the mix for these articles. For this issue, he's penned the commentary titled The Pivotal Role of Equipment Manufacturers in Specialty Geotechnical Construction. And this is what we'll be speaking with him about today. Donald holds degrees in geology and geotechnical engineering from Aberdeen University in Scotland. He worked for specialty geotechnical contractor Coalcrete Limited for almost 10 years in between the UK, Pakistan, Hong Kong, Egypt, and throughout the Middle East. He then joined Pittsburgh-based Nicholson Construction as technical director, working on projects throughout the U.S. and Canada. In '96, he went on to establish Geosystems LP, which is a consultancy specializing in more practical aspects of micropiles, drilling, grouting, anchoring, diaphragm walls, and deep mixing. Donald works throughout the world, principally as a member of various boards of consultants or in support of litigation. He's published over 300 technical papers and co-authored 3 textbooks. He's an active member of many professional societies, including ASCE, ADSC, DFI, USSD, ASDSO, AEG, and ISM. Donald received ASCE's Cap Baker Awards and was the 2015 Tersaghi Lecturer. In 2009, was the ISM's Lizzie Lecturer and the USSD's Legacy Lecturer. The geoconstruction field is in some ways, a lot like the computer industry, right? The second a new technique or methodology is introduced, someone turns around and makes a bigger, faster, stronger version. And that's not unlike construction and not unlike the computer industry. The improvements we implement in foundation construction are not necessarily to the system or technique, so to speak, but rather how the system or the technique is conducted. With that being the case, it's important to acknowledge that these changes are not really the doing of the design engineer, but rather the equipment that's doing the installing of the foundations, of the anchors, and of the earth retention elements. So today we're going to focus mostly on the equipment rather than the process, and then drill into that, so to speak. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, send them in the chat feature. We'll try and get to all of them as we make it through our time together. And with that, Donald, how you doing today?
Very fine, Chris. How are you doing yourself?
I'm hanging in there. It's a very nice day. Got rid of the humidity here in DC finally. So
that was a nice introduction you gave me. I wrote it myself, you know that.
Fair enough. Well, you did a lovely job writing it. I just want to jump right into it. I mean, let's, if you don't mind, just give us a quick overview of what your commentary piece was about.
Sure, Chris. And my thanks to Brad and all the folks at the Geo-Institute and GEOSTRATA for organizing this and inviting me to do this interview with you. So the little introductory paper then, Chris, at the time of writing it, I knew the other authors and I knew what their broad themes might be, but obviously I hadn't seen the paper. So I guessed equipment would be a good and a strong common theme. I then wanted to challenge what I call the pecking order paradigm in our industry, which has owners at the top of the pyramid, followed by consultants, then the general contractors, and then at the bottom, the specialty contractors, and even worse, those that supply them. This is a false perspective. The reality is that our industry is more like a chain than a pyramid. Each participant is an essential link. All participants have equal relevance in ensuring a successful project. The specialty contractors cannot fulfill their roles without safe and effective equipment and materials. And in this regard, we should not by any means overlook the contributions of the drilling consumables suppliers or the manufacturers of chemical admixtures. All these types of companies are links in the chain. They're all bricks in the wall, as Pink Floyd would say.
I mean, you summed up pretty good. I mean, to me, the main point was loud and clear that you just touched on that, the equipment manufacturers, that was a great way of putting it, that it's not a pyramid, but rather a chain. And everyone is a vital cog in that machine, in that chain. But to your point, maybe those manufacturers aren't always getting perhaps the recognition. Every time there's a load test that, the biggest case on or the highest load or the, pushing the boundaries, the manufacturers aren't really getting the same recognition as the installers or the engineers. So, as an industry, what should we be doing differently to perhaps shine the spotlight on these guys and bring awareness to like the ideas and the creativity that they have as designers?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Chris. I fully agree with you. The manufacturers are typically overlooked when it comes to writing up project case histories. The designers and the contractors tend to steal the spotlight. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way life is. It's a bit like conducting a strategic interview with the president of Hertz and then not mentioning the makes of the cars that they provide. Perhaps the answer to your second question is, do we need to shine the spotlight? And further, do the manufacturers themselves really want the spotlight? After all, they've got no real control over the operation of their equipment, and it's poor operation which can ruin a project at the end of the day. Sure, the publicity and the promotion are always good, but in my experience, the manufacturers have excellent marketing and sales teams. They focus on developing strong personal contacts with the key players in the contractor staffs. Sometimes the manufacturers prefer to stay under the radar with certain clients and for certain projects. Their days come with the massive trade shows and exhibitions. That's when they're in the spotlight, Chris. Exhibitions and shows like Bauma, for example, and our own IFCEE conferences. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. Spotlight's good, but sometimes it's best to be in the shadows.
No, fair enough. And you're right. You touch on, I was just down in Dallas for FC, and as a dynamic compaction contractor, we manufacture weights, right? And we fix beat up cranes, right? That's what we do. So it's always kind of neat to me, even though I'm in that specialty contractor realm, to walk around the lot and see these drills and augers and all these different, pieces of equipment that are being developed and thought up. So that's always a neat thing to see, for sure.
Sure is.
One of the points you made in your commentary was that, great ideas are kind of, taken and run with, they could spread like wildfire. You also provided an anecdote about the equipment that went for a weekend getaway to a competitor's shop, theoretically. The proprietary aspect, though, of equipment development is a very real thing in our business. So what's been your experience with the balance between guarding, trade secrets, so to speak, and knowledge sharing for the greater good of the industry?
Yeah, that's a tough one there, Chris. And incidentally, the story about the hydro mill was true. I was not personally involved, so it wasn't my fault, but the story is true. On the trade secrets thing, my experience has generally been that the players in the field have excellent intelligence about their competitors' developments and product lines. Staff go to exhibitions, they talk to contractors, and of course, they swap jobs. Somebody that's in one company 1 year ends up in the same position in another company the following year. So it's a result. Price, product availability, and product service tend to be key determinants when selecting a particular type of equipment. And of course, certain contractors have long-term relationships with a certain manufacturer, which allows them to standardize their training programs and also to optimize their spare part inventories. Other contractors may be in a group which also has manufacturing arm, say like Bauer or Trevi as examples. Some other groups, like Keller, have exclusive deals with foreign companies. So in summary, Chris, I'm not a specialist in patent law, but I would perceive that so-called protectable ideas are being replaced by incremental equipment enhancements. I think there are a few real trade secrets in the industry for all these reasons.
No, I guess that's a fair point. And, maybe you look at it the flip side, trade secrets for equipment are one thing, but it's to your point about someone in an equipment position on one company going to another company. The same thing could happen with an engineer or with a, operator or with a, all kind of up and down the ladder. That could happen.
Absolutely, Chris. And the other thing that happens as well is that even, the drillers and the superintendents, they may be working in different companies, but at one time they've all either been in the same family or they've worked in the same company. So if they have a problem in Seattle in job A, chances are that guy's going to call his buddy in Morgantown, West Virginia that evening and discuss it.
Yeah.
It's a good masonry, this business, and I don't think there's a lot of secrets outside the masonry. Put it there.
No, I mean that's a good point. I mean, with being a company that relies fairly heavily on union labor, depending on what jurisdictions we're going into. One year we may have some guys working for us that had worked for one of our competitors the year before, and so you kind of hear, oh well, these guys did this and we liked it, or these guys did this and it was terrible, or so you're right. The guys across the industry are definitely talking on many levels.
No question, Chris.
Let's shift gears for a minute. I wanted to talk about your 2015 Terzaghi lecture. In that lecture, you talked about this concept of the Great Leap theory and how it applied more broadly to geotechnical construction kind of overall. However, it can easily be applied to the discussion we're having right now. So how do you see that Great Leap theory maybe more narrowly being applied just to equipment rather than kind of the overall techniques?
Yeah, just to go back a step then, Chris, for our listeners here, Great Leap theory was basically that in our processes, they don't just drift along and you look back over 20 years and they're all a lot better. There tends to be just a leap a jump on a particular project or group of projects. And that was what Great Leap was all about. I still believe in it. And of course, the role of the equipment manufacturer is an integral and an essential part of that development. Without the equipment, you can't leap. And the developments in the drilling and the grouting and the deep mixing and the cutoff walls that I described over the last 20 to 30 years clearly prove this. And of course, I've no doubt that my colleagues could cite similar examples in other ground engineering techniques, like your own, or large diameter piling, or anchoring, or something like that. However, I believe that it's not the equipment manufacturer who is the prime mover in Great Leap theory. Integral and essential, yes, but not the progenitor. No manufacturer is going to invent a new machine without a clear market and an application for it. There must be a problem to solve before a solution can be developed.
No, that's an excellent point, and we see that year after year with some of these advances and the equipment, the bits, all these things. They seem to be, you're right, they're being developed for a reason, not just like, hey, let's come up with this and see where we go. So no, that's a good point. In your Great Leap theory, specifically point number 3 is, I think it's intriguing here. What that point stated was that you need a responsible individual or agency for the owner that will be prepared to take that perceived risk of deploying this new technology, right? So this can absolutely be applied to the equipment aspect, but rather than a willing owner, you need a risk-taking specialty subcontractor who's willing to try something out new. So, in the US here, as geotechnical engineers, we generally don't want anything to do with attorneys because that meant something went wrong, right? And so we have a fairly litigious setting here in the US. So how have you seen the rollout of new equipment most successfully be tried out and implemented in the face of perceived and or real risk?
Well, okay, let's leave aside the owner's risk aspect, is what I did talk about primarily in the lecture. Let's focus then on the contractor and the manufacturing risk. I think it's very much, Chris, a give and take relationship. The contractor is going to approach a manufacturer with a particular need, say for a certain kind of rig or a certain kind of drill tooling system. The manufacturer responds. He's caught a live one, and often, in this initial response, it's under some kind of exclusive deal. There are secrets involved at that point. So let's assume the job is built, the equipment works, and soon everybody knows about it in the industry. The manufacturer then approaches other contractors and often vice versa. So the idea spreads very quickly. So the risk at the beginning, I think in short, Chris, to answer your question, is mitigated by the developmental relationship with the first user, first responder. And the risk thereafter is managed by technical promotion, after-sales service, and product reliability and quality. Competitors are then attracted to the pool, following hard on the heels of the pioneers. The development of drilling and grouting practices in North America since 1996 is the classic example, as I detailed in the Tozagi. And that's where a certain contractor worked with a certain consultant, and they went to a certain manufacturer to get the drilling rig they actually wanted for the ideas that they had in mind. It worked beautifully. And now there's at least, say, 5 or 6 similarly equipped and resourced contracting consulting groups in the US. It works well.
It's funny because I listened to you respond to that point, and what I'm hearing is something, if you talk to any of the staff engineers that have worked for me, my superintendents that I'm working with now, I harp on relationships. And that was exactly, I think, what you're talking about there. So when there's trust involved, there's less likely to be fear of that risk because that relationship between the contractor and the specialty, the manufacturer, has presumably been developed over a long period of time. So they know they're working with guys that they trust. So
absolutely. That's a good summary, Chris.
It all comes back to relationships.
For sure. Absolutely.
let's follow up on this point though for a second. So I mean, when I read your bio that you provided, I mean, my immediate reaction was a feeling of inadequacy from the lack of work I've done worldwide, right? But you've got a career's worth of experience across the globe. What have you seen? I think primarily we're talking about, we're talking to a U.S. based audience right now for the most part, I think. And so we've been kind of talking about the rollout of this equipment here in the U.S. But how have you seen the contrast maybe elsewhere in the world in terms of techniques, equipment, being rolled out compared to here?
And Chris, don't be worried about lack of overseas work. Overseas travel is one of the greatly overrated pastimes ever. But in the broadest terms, the original manufacturing concepts have occurred primarily in certain parts of Europe and in Japan, as well as in North America. And in recent years, we've also had what we can kindly and politically correctly call derivative products, which have appeared from other countries, primarily in Eastern Asia. We all have already, you and I, discussed how things work domestically, a very pragmatic, usually project-related symbiosis. You described the relationships are so important. For me, the greatest contrast, though, has been with the process used in Japan, a country which we know has a large population, but a relatively small amount of usable land. And even the reclaimed ground, which I think is about 25% of its total usable area, has problems, seismically fragile.
Sure.
So in the 1970s, when the Japanese stock market was going gangbusters and there was a lot of money flying around, development was just crazy. In those years, various government agencies, such like the Port and Harbour Authority, basically commissioned new techniques and their equipment to improve the native and the filled soils. The deep mixing methods and jet grouting are prime examples. These government agencies then basically licensed these new technologies to the contractors, operating under technology-specific trade association agreements. So in summary, innovation in the US comes from the contractors and the manufacturers and would go around the chain that way or up the pyramid, depending on what you believe. Whereas in Japan, it came from the owner, the other way around the chain or down the pyramid. And that, to me, is the major difference that I've seen in processes, Chris. Now, in Europe, it's maybe in between these extremes, and especially in France and in Germany and Italy, during the years that they were doing the big tunneling, especially in urban areas. And they really had to be a little bit more innovative with their acquisition. But the extremes, in my opinion, are us at one end and the Japanese, our friends in Japan, at the other end.
Oh, that's interesting. Just hearing how things work in different parts of the world is always, it's an interesting thing to see. I mean, I've had an opportunity to travel a little internationally to see some different projects in Asia and in China and things like that. And yeah, every time you go somewhere, it's almost like a night and day experience with the way things work one place versus the other.
Oh, I could not agree more. Could not agree more, Chris. And in the same way, it would be difficult for us as American consultants and contractors to work in some countries. When these people come to North America, it's equally difficult for them in a slightly different way. And I always have sympathy. And the miracle is that so many of the Japanese and European contractors are so actively engaged in our US ground engineering. And it's a testament not just to their skill and their knowledge, but also to their stickability. And especially when it comes to reading contracts and having to deal with attorneys and so on, I always have sympathy with these folks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mentioned I'm a specialty contractor myself, and again, right, I like to refer in my elevator speech to dynamic compaction as the brute force method of ground improvement, right? We pick things up and we put them down. And so, as I said, that doesn't lend itself to cool, neat, fancy drilling equipment, things of that nature. But the cranes are most assuredly a different story. And in the recent, the last couple of years, we've added some of these more modern, the Liebherrs that have the computerized systems and comfortable air conditioned cabs. And it's very clear that those new pieces of equipment can be easier to run with far less experience, right? The converse to that is the majority of our fleet is these older American friction crawler cranes, right? That have been, they haven't been making those since the 70s. And if you don't have an experienced American guy in the seat, you can do a lot of damage to a crane very, very quickly, right? The problem with that is, since those are older pieces of equipment, right? The guys that know how to run these things and fix these things are becoming fewer and farther between as they all start to get to retirement. So let's speak for a second to the impact that these advances on equipment is potentially going to have on the labor side of the industry.
Yeah, just fundamental, Chris. I mean, you really phrased that question very well. It's fundamental. In my opinion, one of the biggest challenges facing the specialty construction industry is, and will continue to be, and it's going to get worse, specialist labor, how to recruit them, how to train them, and most important for guys like yourself, how to retain them in time as well. We're in an entirely different market now from that, say, when the heroes returned in their millions from the construction battalions after World War II, or when the baby boomers who rebuilt the world in the subsequent decades passed through the system. Entirely different philosophy, generations, and linked to the equipment as well, as you said, Chris. And of course, we've now got subsequent generations, and this is where I really speak as an old man, whose idea of fun is not to work long hours on construction sites, often far from the parents' house. So what can we do? Well, I think we can focus on providing, as you said, safe, comfortable working conditions, both in and out of the camp. We can introduce the practical aspects of AA and IT and so on. As described in the papers by Frederick Massa and Tony Marinucci. This will enhance quality and productivity, but it's also going to attract certain young people who just like that kind of stuff, like playing with the IT and the AA. Formalized, recognized training and education schemes to produce, for example, a class of operators, professional class of known, for example, in Germany, as you know, as drill masters. Let's give these people that operate these $5 and $6 million rigs the kind of uniform, the philosophical uniform and recognition that really their skills develop. And of course, you also got to pay them,
right,
in accordance with their rank as well. So I think there's a lot of things we can do. At the end of the day, I think the key word is safety. If our young people feel safe operating big equipment on big sites, then you're going to attract a lot more than otherwise.
No, that's an interesting perspective, because it's something that we're constantly grappling with as a contractor. And like you said, you foresee it getting worse instead of better in the at least in the short term. And it's
I'm afraid so.
Yeah, it's always a challenge to find the guys with the knowledge base for some of the older equipment. Let me shift gears for a minute.
I mean, sure.
No, go right ahead.
No, I was just going to put in a little extra there, Chris, and say that we can't get people to work in our restaurants just now after the COVID crisis. How are we going to get people to drive our rigs?
It's an excellent. That's an excellent
question.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think that's a discussion for the sake of our viewers we're not going to get into right now.
I think that's a good one. Yeah.
Let's shift gears again for a second here. I think back to my time. I've kind of had career one, career two, right? The front half of my career was as a geotechnical consultant. Now I'm on the dark side, so to speak, as a contractor, right? But I think back to maybe my time as a consultant, and you come out of school, you know the engineering behind these techniques, in theory, what's supposed to be happening, but you really don't have a grasp, I think, if you're, and I'm sure I'm painting with a pretty broad brush here, but for the most part, if you're on the consultant side, you really don't have the grasp of the equipment that the folks on the equipment side and the contractor sides do. And so as I've progressed as a contractor, I, read reports, read specs, do dynamic compaction, use this weight, this height combo, it's things that are physically not possible given the constraints of equipment, right? So as the equipment advances, as we move forward, I mean, what from a consultant side, do you feel that their role should be still to just kind of stick with performance-based specs and stay the hell out of the contractor's way, or how do you think you bridge that gap there?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question for you, who has seen the light and escaped from consultancy. It's a good question to ask. I'm a great believer still in performance specifications and contracting in our specialty geotechnical work, because you're really looking to engage the head of the contractor as well as the arms and the legs. The experience and the expertise that these people have gained often at a very high cost in every way over the years. But I have one big caveat, Chris, and that is the consultant should always clearly state what is not acceptable in terms of a technique or a piece of equipment. So, for example, using air flush in rock fissure grouting under a dam is not acceptable. Single tube advancement for, say, a micropile is on when drilling under a poor foundation in Boston, or when drilling through an embankment dam. Otherwise, allow the contractor to select the means and methods to allow the project to be built safely and with a quality consistent with the design assumptions and requirements. This day and age, our engineering really is becoming so sophisticated, and it's impossible for our colleagues who work in consultancies to keep up with everything. I mean, the rate at which computer technology, like before, is developing and evolving, and that's almost like a full-time job just to try and do that. So, yeah, have faith, have trust in the contractor, but always, for a logical reason, be prepared to stand your ground and say, no, this is not acceptable, and make that clear in the specs. Don't wait for them to get the job, assuming one thing, and then to be on site and be prevented. So grab that flower right up front and say, no, you can't do it. That's the caveat, Chris.
No, and that's a good point. I mean, I think now over the 9 or 10 years I've been doing this, I do feel like the best relationships I have with geotech consultants, they're always the ones that are, before they write a report, they're calling me, bouncing ideas off. Hey, we have to get this report out, but we think this is a good idea, or, and maybe they're not thinking of an aspect that I might be thinking of, or maybe they pick up on something because they've been on site doing the investigation that I'm not picking up on. So I think that collaboration, again, come back to the relationship aspect of it, I think is a very vital part of the industry. And to your point, maybe put constraints on it in terms of perimeter conditions or what they don't want to see, but, let the contractor choose the most effective, method on the job. So I think that's
right with you, mate.
Well taken.
Yeah, no, you've summarized that well. And the other thing I was going to say, Chris, is that especially on bigger projects, what can be very helpful for the consultant is to engage a construction consultant, like an internal board of consultants role, just almost like a construction feasibility review person. And that could be, for example, somebody that you hire in, project specific, or it could be, one of your senior project managers or internal consultants, that has built things, back in the 70s or 80s and 90s, and is able to impart that kind of practical knowledge. That's another way to guard and to safeguard and protect the consultant's position.
No, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I mean, that makes me think, I probably spend a solid third of my week giving free consulting to, GCs. They'll see a report and they'll see one thing one way, and it's like, well, can you just pound it? Does that work? And sometimes the answer is, yeah, I could take a look at this as an alternative. And sometimes the answer is no, the geotech was right. They wrote the report that way for a reason, but it's that kind of, just wanting to get a gut check on things. And so, yeah, I think it's a valuable interface across the various, kind of breaks down those bond or the doors that maybe can exist between the consultants and the contractors.
I'm surprised only 1/3 of your time is free consulting.
Well, the other part is, I got to walk my dogs at some point too. That takes a while.
There you go. That's fair enough.
Let's talk about the younger field engineers. You know, younger field engineers, more seasoned project managers. You know, we've talked about it a little bit about this, you know, perceiving of a knowledge gap and how a lot of the foundation ground improvement equipment, what it can and can't do. So for the consultant side, again, you know, what suggestions would you have as to what's the best way to keep current on these advancements that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes here? Is it the shows? Is it, you know, what are your thoughts on that? How to keep current on this stuff?
Yeah, and I think you really put your finger on the main one there. But Chris, this whole issue, you know, how we keep current and how we can keep our younger engineers aware is one of my big personal crusades, and it's basically mentorship. And in the old days, you know, we'd have apprenticeships where, you know, our younger engineers would work under the direct supervision, as you still have to do for your PE now, of course, in some ways.
Yep.
But it's become, I think, less formalized than it used to. And in my opinion, in every company, every construction company at least, there should be a formal mentorship program. So that you're associated with a senior experience. Maybe a young structural engineer should work with a grizzled old site superintendent for a while. Maybe that young man or lady should work in the estimating department and not just in the design group for a while, you know, to gain knowledge, but to gain perspective as well. So I think a lot of it is going to be done by personal osmosis, you know, within your own working environment. But I think it's also absolutely vital, Chris, that our young engineers are top of the list when it comes to attendance at conferences and trade shows and to sign up for committees. You know yourself, it costs a lot of money to send people to these shows and exhibitions. But typically, we're sending perhaps senior people, with all due respect, older people who already know it. What you need to do is to make sure that these young people are exposed in these settings so that they can develop their own network of peers, young men and women of more or less their own age group and experience. And as they grow older, as they age. So they look back after 20 years and they know presidents of companies and principals of consultants and stuff like that. So I think we really need to look at who we send to conferences and why. And in this regard, I think the restrictions that have been placed on us all by COVID have really forced us to do things like this, which is excellent. It's the best thing we can possibly. But I think that we all agree that there's no substitute just for being there in person and just looking at somebody in the eye. Nothing really substitutes for the human touch, and that applies in our learning, in our teaching, and transmitting information and knowledge. So, yeah, this is the best we're doing right now. You're doing a super job, but I'm looking forward to seeing everybody back in person soon.
No, and that's a good point you touch on, because I mean, I think back to, you know, being 6 months out of school, staff engineer, going to one or two conferences, and you kind of walk around, especially like you get into the exhibit halls and stuff, like, and your head's spinning because you haven't seen half this stuff, you haven't talked to these kind of people. But to your point, the upside to the transition to a lot of the online stuff, like what we're doing right now, has been, I've, you know, quote unquote, attended conferences in Dubai, I've been in California one day, I've been in Minnesota in the next. So there's been an opportunity to interface with people more. But the downside is, as someone that's normally at the national conferences as an exhibitor, there is no substitute for being able to walk around that room and look at the equipment and talk to people and try and learn that way. So I think myself, anyone that's watching, you know, I think everyone echoes the sentiment of being happy to be able to be back in that setting here soon.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, mate. I mean, thinking of myself, you know, say in the last 30 years or so, I was probably averaging about 7 or 8 conferences a year. And you get to the point where you're becoming asymptotic regarding meeting new people. You go there and you immediately fall in with the crowd that you were at the last conference with, and that's it. Whereas the first two conferences I ever went to, one in the Institute of Civil Engineers in London back in '76, and then the New Orleans conference, the grouting conference in '82, these are still absolutely seared in my memory. The heroes that I met, the people that you were scared to go and approach because you only heard about them by reputation. Many people perhaps tuning in today will know Don Deere, the great rock mechanics guy. And I was just enthralled. And then, of course, so much so that he got me to change his slides when he was making his presentation. I'll never forget that, I worked for Don Deere. But no, I think get the young people out. That's where the network has to be founded. No question.
No, I couldn't agree more. I'm looking through. We had more of a comment come in. I figured I'd just address and see if you had any thoughts. But one of the comments that came in was, the biggest drawback I find being a consultant first is not understanding the fundamentals of soil mechanics, which is gained really from, interpreting lab testing, interpreting in situ data, which maybe as the contractor, you're drawing more into that. I mean, what are your thoughts on that point?
Oh, that's a hot question just now, because in a way we are kind of diverging, Chris. Our theoretical ground engineers are becoming more extreme, and our contractors are perhaps becoming a little bit more pragmatic. But again, it comes down to communication. Site investigation reports should be written not to satisfy a PhD thesis. They should be written in order to allow a contractor to economically and safely build a project. So
Right.
There has to be a middle ground. And at the same time, it's evil, really, to have these massively detailed, almost theoretical soil mechanics thesis, which ultimately just form a fishing net for the attorneys if something were to go wrong.
Right.
And then they go to the contractor and they say, well, look, on page 532, why didn't you see that value was 0.02? I mean, it works both ways. It really does.
No, that's interesting. Well, look, Donald, this has been a real pleasure for me having a chance to chat. I don't know. I mean, is there any final thoughts? Anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to touch on at this point, or?
Well, right back at you, Chris. It's been a pleasure for me as well, and my thank you for everybody listening in. I'd just like to maybe give a shout out to the other authors in that very fine copy of GeoStrata. And, from good to great, the boys, Pablo Basola and his colleagues on the evolution of QA/QC in dams over the years is a terrific paper. And that's going to be a true legacy. And to go back to your point about specifications, Chris, anybody that's considering writing a specification for QA/QC in a dam cutoff should read this paper. It is just excellent. Then, although it's not really my field, the IoT and the big data on geotechnical construction, Frederic Mass and his colleagues, his AME, I should call them, fascinating paper. And I think it's almost like a lure to the engineers that we talked about before. They're more inclined to the IT as opposed to the muddy boots aspect of our work.
Mm-hmm.
But we need everybody. Paolo's paper, my friend Paolo Gazzarini, just an excellent example of how to describe the evolution of a specialty grouting, specialty construction technique. And I thought it was an excellent illustration of practical collaboration, especially in jet grouting, between geotechnical engineers, mechanical engineers, and the hydraulic engineers, because all the developments that really matter in the last few years have all been about developing or improving hydraulic efficiency of jet grout systems. So really cool. Jim DeWill was a fascinating paper, The Working Platforms. It's such a relevant paper, Chris, and it's on a sadly overlooked issue, but one that seriously and fundamentally affects safety, come back to that word again, productivity and quality. I mean, just a terrific paper. We see in many dam grouting jobs, people unwilling to put down a concrete working platform, put down some crushed stone. It is absolutely counterproductive in every way.
Mm-hmm.
Chris Ryan, is one of the leaders in deep mixing technology in this country, has been for many years, as one of the first people to introduce it into the US. And of course, his expertise in the soil bentonite walls, just terrific. A good paper, a really good paper. And for those of us who are like industrial archaeologists, it's always fascinating to trace the evolution of a subject. And I think his paper is just invaluable in that regard. And then our esteemed Dr. Tony Marinucci and Howard Garrison, the intelligent geoconstruction drilling equipment. What a thoughtful, practical discourse, strongly featuring one of our common passions, namely measurement while. And I love the quote, and maybe it's a good way to end this session, Chris. They recycled the old quote from Yogi Berra: "You can observe a lot by just watching." And I think that's terrific.
Absolutely. Well, that's a very nice summary of the issue. Again, I appreciate the time. This has been, I haven't had much of an opportunity to talk with you before, so this is great. Been getting to know you a little bit. I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing you in person at some of our industry events, things of that nature, as we move forward. With that, Brad, do you want to wrap us up?
I will always take an opportunity to talk. I do want to say thanks to both you, Chris, and Donald. This was really great today. I think it was probably the most theoretical GeoStrata Extra that we've had, which is excellent, especially, Donald, when you back it up with all the field experience you've had over the years. We really enjoyed that. So thanks for your insights today. I also want to mention to everybody, because I don't think we say this enough, not on this show, GeoStrata is a completely volunteer-run publication. All the content that you see in there, with the exception of some of the news and notes stuff in the back that staff writes, all the feature articles, all the columns up in the front, those are all done by volunteers. The editors are all volunteers. Jim Withiam, our chief editor for the past 21 years, is a volunteer, which makes it even more amazing that we're able to get this publication out the door 6 times a year and have it look, feel, and maybe smell. Does it smell good? As good as it does. And we're very proud of it. So thanks to everybody who volunteers on GeoStrata as well. I will remind you one more time to subscribe to our channel, to click get notifications. We have a lot of other good stuff up here. There's a particular show called Director's Cut that a certain director hosts that's out every week, that's hilarious, that I would encourage you to watch. And there's a lot of other good stuff up there too. You can watch Donald's 2015 Terzaghi lecture. If you look at the Terzaghi lecture playlist, you will find it there in line with every Terzaghi lecture from the last 10 years now. So check that out. And thanks again to everybody for joining us today, sticking with us till the end. We really appreciate it. We'll be back at the end of the summer with the next episode of GeoStrata Extra. And until then, have a great summer. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad.